Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
Madam President, I rise to discuss my opposition to the pending vote concerning Mr. Tony Blinken, who is not only unqualified, but in fact, in my view, one of the worst selections of a very bad lot that this president has chosen. I hope that many of my colleagues will understand that not often do I come to the floor to oppose a nomination of the President of the United States, because I believe that elections have consequences. In this case, this individual has actually been dangerous to America and to the young men and women who are fighting and serving it. Mr. Blinken has been a foreign policy advisor to Vice President Biden since his days in the Senate. But as Robert Gates has noted, Mr. Biden has been, quote, wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. At the Special Operations Fund annual meeting on May 6, 2013, Mr. Blinken discussed a number of the administration's achievements, including 1, ending the war in Iraq responsibly, 2, setting a clear strategy and date for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, 3, decimating al-Qaeda's senior leadership, and 4, repairing our alliances and restoring America's standing in the world. That is as Orwellian as any statement I have ever heard. Each and every issue, the conditions are a far cry from the so-called achievements that Mr. Blinken describes. In his capacity as an assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor, Mr. Blinken has been a functionary and an agent of a U.S. foreign policy that has made the world much less safe today. Let's just review some of the elements in particular and Mr. Blinken's role in conceptualizing and furthering it. U.S. foreign policy is in a shambles. It's at best a strategic and at worst anti-strategic. It lacks any concept of how to obtain our foreign policy goals. This has led to countless foreign policy failures, including the continued slaughter of the Syrian people by President Bashar al-Assad, the Russian reset that culminated in President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the betrayal of our key allies, especially in Central Europe, not to mention Israel, failing to achieve a status of force agreement that would help to maintain Iraq's security and stability, following similarly unwise strategies in Afghanistan. We will see the same movie in Afghanistan that we saw in Iraq if we have a date-driven withdrawal rather than a status-driven, conditions-driven situation. And our feckless position in negotiations with Iran on nuclear weapons that has failed to produce any progress towards an agreement. I could go into many other failures, such as the vaunted Geneva Convention of 40 nations that was supposed to help or arrange for the transition from power from Bashar Assad, the abject failure of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, and what will be either an imminent failure of Iranian nuclear weapons agreement or an agreement that will be disastrous in the long run. There are 2 common sayings by the administration officials, not me, that have defined the president's approach to foreign policy: leading from behind and, quote, don't do stupid stuff. These approaches have resulted in a failed foreign policy that has made America and Americans less safe. Even President Obama's most strident supporters have begun to question the president's foreign policy decisions. In an article titled "Damage to Obama's Foreign Policy Has Been Largely Self-Inflicted," the Washington Post's David Ignatius, a key supporter of the administration's foreign policy goals, wrote that, quote, at key turning points in Egypt and Libya during the Arab Spring in Syria, in Ukraine, and yes, in Benghazi, the administration was driven by messaging priorities rather than sound interest-based policy. So what has Mr. Blinken had to say about all of these issues, my friends? Let me give you a few. On Iraq, at the Center for American Progress on March 16, 2012, now I'm not making this one up, Mr. Blinken said, quote, "What's beyond debate is that Iraq today is less violent, more democratic, and more prosperous, and the United States more deeply engaged there than at any time in recent history. Less violent, more democratic, and more prosperous." At a White House briefing on March 16, 2012, Mr. Blinken said, and all these are quotes, "President Obama and Vice President Biden come to office with this commitment to end the Iraq war responsibly. Both parts of that sentence are critical. End the war responsibly." Under the leadership of President Obama and Vice President Biden, who the President asked to oversee our Iraq policy, has made 8 trips to Iraq since being elected, we followed that path to the letter. And he went on to say, quote, "At every step along the way, many predicted that the violence would return and Iraq would slide backward toward sectarian war." Get this, he said, "Those predictions proved wrong." Over the past 3 years, he went on to say, "Over the past 3 years, violence has declined and remains at historic lows, even after we completed the drawdown of U.S. forces late last year." Remember, he said this in 2012. Weekly security incidents fell from an average of 1,600 in 2007-2008 to fewer than 100 today. Then he went on to say, and in December, after more than 8 wrenching years, President Obama kept his promise to end the war responsibly. And while Iran and Iraq will inevitably be more entwined than we and many of its neighbors would like, he went on to say, "One thing we learned over more than 8 years in Iraq is that the vast majority of its leaders, including the Prime Minister, who at that time was Prime Minister Maliki, are first and foremost Iraqi nationalists and resistance to outside influence from anywhere, starting with Iran." Everybody knows the Iranians are probably the most influential nation in Iraq, certainly under Maliki. In foreign policy on December 27, 2013, he said, "If we still had troops in Iraq today, the numbers would have been very small. They would not have been engaged in combat. That would not have been their mission. So the idea that they could or would have done something about the violence that's going on now in Iraq seems to me detached from the reality of what the mission would have been had they stayed in any small number." Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Take the word of Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, Ambassador Crocker, and any knowledgeable person about Iraq. And I will insert their quotes for the record, including Ambassador Crocker, who said, "Of course we could have left a residual force behind." Both Panetta and Gates both said the same thing. And at no time was there a public statement by the President of the United States or Mr. Blinken that they wanted to very seriously. In fact, they trumpeted the fact when the last American troop at that time, now we have many back, but when they left, bragging about what a great day that it was. On Fox News with Chris Wallace, September 28, 2014, Wallace, "Finally, President Obama spoke to the UN this week, but I want to ask you about his speech to the UN saying General Assembly last year, in which he said we were ending a decade of war. How could the President have been so wrong?" Blinken, "The President was exactly right. The President was exactly right. What we're doing is totally different than the last decade. We're not sending hundreds of thousands of American troops back into Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else. We're not going to be spending trillions of American dollars." Wallace, "Mr. Blinken, he said all our troops have left Iraq. In fact, he has just sent at least 1,600 troops back into Iraq. He said we've dismantled the core of al-Qaeda, and yet the Khorasan group, which you struck in the first day, is an offshoot of the core of al-Qaeda, and in fact, follows the direct orders of the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Blinken, Chris, they fled because we were so successful and effective in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They fled because we decimated the core of al-Qaeda. They removed themselves. They went to Syria. At the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace on October 30th, 2014, the White House sought to leave a limited residual force in Iraq, but the Iraqi government simply refused to agree to legal protections for such troops, said then Deputy National Security Advisor Tony Blinken, who argued the final decision to withdraw all U.S. troops was not the result of a failure to negotiate. Quote, "It's something we worked very hard," he said, "but after a 10-year occupation, the Iraqi body politic did not want us to stay in Iraq. That's what happened. We were focused on acting on ISIL and the threat that it posed more than a year before the fall of Mosul. But the problem began to outrun the solution, fueled by the conflict in Syria, Iraqi reluctance, and renewed sectarianism in Iraq in advance of elections, with politicians on all sides playing to their bases." You know, I mean, statements like these, I mean, they are so divorced from reality, one can only draw one of two conclusions. One, that Mr. Blinken is abysmally ignorant, or he's just simply not telling the truth for whatever motive there is. And by the way, here's what Ryan Crocker said on Iraq. We got the other one. As a quote, "As a former ambassador to Iraq 2007-2009, do you think it was a mistake not to push hard for the status of force agreement with Iraq before the U.S. pullout?" I would remind my colleagues, Ryan Crocker, probably the most respected member of our diplomatic corps in America alive today. He said, "I do. We could have gotten that agreement if we'd have been a little more persistent, flexible, and creative. But what really cost us was the political withdrawal. We cut off high-level political engagement with Iraq when we withdrew our troops. There were no senior visits, very few phone calls. Secretary of State John Kerry made one visit prior to this current crisis, mainly to lecture the Iraqis on how bad they were being for facilitating Iranian weapons systems to Syrian President Bashar Assad, and we left them to their own devices, knowing that left to their own devices, it would not work out well." So you have Mr. Blinken's comments and juxtapose them with those of Ambassador Crocker. Here's what Leon Panetta, Democrat, Secretary of Defense, said. Quote, "It was clear to me and many others that withdrawing all our forces would endanger the fragile stability then barely holding Iraq together." That's from Secretary Leon Panetta's book. And then he went on to say, "My fear, as I voiced to the President and others, was that if the country split apart or slid back into the violence that we'd seen in the years immediately following the U.S. invasion, it could become a new haven for terrorists to plot attacks against the U.S. Iraq's stability was not only in Iraq's interest, but also in ours. I privately and publicly advocated for a residual force that could provide training and security for Iraq's military." Then he went on to say, "Those on our side," talking about the Pentagon, "those on our side viewed the White House as so eager to rid itself of Iraq that it was willing to withdraw rather than lock in arrangements that would preserve our influence and interests." That is a statement by Leon Panetta. On Afghanistan, I'll move on to Afghanistan. Mr. Blinken said, quote, "We've been very clear. We've been consistent. The war will be concluded by the end of 2014. We have a timetable, and that timetable will not change." This is why I'm so worried about him being in the position that he's in, because if they stick to that timetable, I am telling my colleagues that we will see the replay of Iraq all over again. We must leave a stabilizing force behind of a few thousand troops, or we will see again what we saw in Iraq. So let's move on to Syria. On an MSNBC interview in 2014 responding to a question about President Obama's comment in August 2014, calling it a fantasy to say that arming the Syrian rebels 3 years ago would have helped the situation. Blinken, fantasy was the notion that had we started to work with these guys, talking about the Free Syrian Army, 6 months earlier, that somehow would have turned the tide, that would have turned the tide. Blinken, Candy, you know Assad has been a magnet for every extremism we're now fighting against, and it's inconceivable to think of Syria being stable with Assad as its leader. He has forfeited his legitimacy. ISIL right now is the wolf at the door, but the answer to both Assad and to ISIL actually is the moderate opposition. They need to be built up so that they can be a counterweight to Assad. In the near term, they need to be built up so they can work on the ground to help deal with ISIL. So ISIS is at the Candy Crowley. So ISIS is at the wolf at the door now, but Assad, as far as U.S. is concerned, is the next wolf at the door. Quote, Mr. Blinken, we have been very clear there needs to be a transition in Syria, that as long as Assad is there, it's very hard to see Syria being stable. He will continue to be a magnet for the extremists we're fighting. But Crowley, but a transition is not the same as we will actively help you bring this guy down. Blinken, the best way to deal with Assad is to transition him out so that the moderate opposition can fill a vacuum. That's what we've been working on. The more you build them up, the more you make them a counterweight, the more possible that becomes. Let me just remind my colleagues of what's happened. There's a guy named Cesar who, about a year and a half ago, smuggled out thousands of pictures. These pictures are the most gripping and horrifying that I have ever seen. And they were pictures, actual pictures, which have been authenticated, of the atrocities committed by Bashar Assad. They're wrenching, they're heartbreaking, and they are terrible. Now, 200,000 people have been butchered in Syria. 3.5 million are refugees. 150,000 are still in Bashar Assad's prison, experiencing things like this. You know, these are little children here. These are little children that have been massacred by Bashar Assad. And what have we done? What have we done in response to this? First of all, amazingly, these photographs have been authenticated by this guy Cesar. He did testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It didn't seem to rise to the interest of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee or the American people or this administration. I was in a refugee camp in Jordan, where at that time there was some, I think, 75,000 refugees. I was being taken around by a young woman, and she said, Senator McCain, who was a school teacher, she said, Senator McCain, see all these children? I said, yes. She said, those children believe that you have abandoned them, Senator McCain, that you Americans have abandoned them. And when they grow up, they're going to take revenge on you. So here we are, this incredible slaughter, massacre, torture taking place. And what is this administration doing? Trying to make a deal with the Iranians and leaving Bashar Assad to wreak havoc on the Syrian people that are still able to fight, butchering them with a thing called barrel bombs. Most of my colleagues know what a barrel bomb is. It's a huge cylinder, and it's packed with explosives and nuts and bolts and pieces of shrapnel. And Bashar Assad, unimpeded, flies over his helicopters and others, and they drop these barrel bombs. And then when they capture these people, this is the kind of thing that is done. So, and today, it is clear that what's happening is that we are attacking ISIS in Syria. We are not attacking Bashar Assad, this butcher. In fact, Bashar Assad has intensified his attacks on the Free Syrian Army, intensified them. And not surprisingly, the morale of the Free Syrian Army is very low. So General Allen and others have recently proposed a no-fly zone or aircraft exclusion zone, something we've been arguing for about 3 years. This president still refuses to do it. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, and it's tragic. And it will go down in American history as one of the most shameful chapters because of our failure and the president's personal decision not to arm the Free Syrian Army when all of his key national security advisors, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, his, head of the CIA, General Petraeus, and Secretary of Defense, Secretary Panetta, all strongly recommended providing arms to the Free Syrian Army. In the case, so I'll move on. On Ukraine, what Putin has seen is the president mobilizing the international community both in support of Ukraine and to isolate Russia for its actions in Ukraine, and Russia is paying a clear cost for that, unquote, from Mr. Blinken. The notion that this is somehow a result of Syria makes very little sense to me. That's because it's not about what we do or say in the first instance. It's about Russia and its perceived interest. What Mr. Blinken doesn't understand is that weakness in one place translates throughout the world. When I tell my colleagues, when I tell my fellow citizens that we will not supply the Ukrainian people with defensive weapons, they don't believe me. They've watched their country dismembered. They've watched Crimea go. They've watched the shoot-down of an airliner that nobody talks about anymore. And they continue to create unrest and killing in eastern Ukraine. And we won't even supply the Ukrainians with weapons with which to defend themselves. I see that I'm nearly out of time. I'd just like to say that I wish that Mr. Blinken's words were matched by his deeds. At the Holocaust Museum, October 6, 2014, he said, "A new notion is gaining currency, the responsibility to protect. It holds that states have responsibilities as well as interests, especially a responsibility to shield their own populations from the depraved and murderers." This approach is bold, it's important, and the United States welcomes it and has included it as a core element of our national security strategy, along with our commitments to prevent genocide and hold those who organize atrocities accountable. No one can look at those pictures, the thousands, and believe that we've held Bashar Assad responsible. He ended up by saying, endorsing the responsibility to protect is one thing, acting on it is another. All of us in the international community will have to muster the political will to act diplomatically, economically, or in extreme cases militarily, when governments prove unable or unwilling to prevent the slaughter of their citizens. That is a remarkable statement from an individual whose actions have clearly contradicted that at every turn in literally every corner of the earth. So, Madam President, I know we will lose the vote probably, but I believe that history will hold this administration accountable, and history will hold those individuals who were part of this administration that allowed these slaughters to go on, the dismemberment of a country called Ukraine. For the first time, a European country has been departitioned since World War II. The needless slaughter of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children. And the list goes on and on. Thousands and thousands of Syrian children. The list goes on and on. And now we are going to promote this individual to replace probably the finest diplomat I've known, Mr. Secretary Burns, who is not only is Mr. Blinken unqualified, but he is, I believe, a threat to the traditional interests and values that embody the United States of America. Madam President, I yield.
Recognize Representative Brian Mast of Florida for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, as the transcript, the leaked transcript, as you referred to it, says, did the President Biden work with the coward exiled president of Afghanistan to manipulate the intelligence about the Taliban?
What the president said to then President Ghani in private is exactly what he said in public, that the issue was not whether Afghanistan had the capacity to withstand the Taliban, it's whether it had the will and the plan to do so. He
He's
urged
saying
him
the transcript is a
to
lie.
show that
It's,
will and
it's
have
false.
that plan.
It's incorrect. He did not
and
work.
to bring people together in
You're saying
unity.
it's false, it's a lie, it's incorrect. He did not work to tamp down the intelligence on the Taliban.
Absolutely not.
So the transcript is incorrect. That's your testimony today.
That the intelligence that we had, we've already discussed at some length about what the assessments were of the Taliban and its capacity to take over the country.
I think that everybody looking for an explanation about what happened and how everybody got it so wrong, how your administration got it so wrong, needs to look at that as the most likely explanation, asking the president to manipulate the intelligence of what was actually going on with the Taliban. And I'm going to tell you the 13 families that deserve most to really hear the honest answers on that. It's these families. Marine Lance Corporal Kareem Nakui. His family deserves to truly know that. Marine Corporal Dagan Page. His family truly deserves to know if that's why they are missing their son because intelligence was manipulated. Marine Lance Corporal Riley McCullum, 20, wife expecting their first child. Sister said he was going to be the best dad ever. They deserve to know if that's what happened and that's why everything went so wrong. Marine Sergeant Nicole Gee, 23 years old. You can see her there holding a young child. Her family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong, because that intelligence was manipulated. Marine Lance Corporal David Espinoza, just 20 years old. Family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong, is because the intelligence was manipulated. Marine Corporal Humberto Sanchez, just 22 years old. Mother said, "My kid was a hero." That's what was said. That's what his mother said. Deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong, because the intelligence got manipulated. Marine Lance Corporal Jared Smits, just 20 years old. Family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong. Marine Corporal Hunter Lopez, just 22, son of 2 sheriffs, plan to follow in their footsteps. Their family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong, is because you all worked to manipulate the intelligence of what was going on the ground there. Marine Corps Staff Sergeant Darren Hoover, his family said, "I love you, son. Check in on us. We will try to make you proud." They deserve to know if that's what happened, if that's how everything went so wrong in Afghanistan. Marine Corps Sergeant Johanny Rosario Picardo, family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong, because you all worked to manipulate the intelligence of what was going on with the Taliban. Marine Lance Corporal Dylan Marola, just 20. Family said he always had a smile on his face, was the kindest person. They deserve to know if that's why everything went so wrong, because you all manipulated intelligence. Army Staff Sergeant Ryan Canals, the ultimate honor he could give was to give back to his country. He would not be sorry. He would not regret it. That's what his family said. They deserve to know if you manipulated intelligence, if President Biden manipulated intelligence, and that's what led to everything going so wrong. Navy Corpsman Maxton Soviak, just 22. His family deserves to know if that's why everything went so wrong. We deserve hearings on what's going on with that leaked transcript. We deserve to know why there are others that remain in Afghanistan. Mark Frericks, Navy veteran, disappeared in Coast Province January 30 of 2020. We deserve to know what's going on with his release. These are things that have to be answered for. I do not believe whatsoever what you're saying about the administration not working to manipulate that intelligence. To me, that is the most logical explanation of how so many in the intelligence community got this so wrong about what was going to happen in Afghanistan. Why it would seem somehow logical for President Biden to leave the, quote, most advanced military weaponry, why some would not speak out against that if they were getting the false intelligence because it was coming from the top down to manipulate it. In my opinion, that's absolutely aid and comfort to the enemy. I absolutely wonder if you were complicit in this as well. I find it hard to believe that President Biden would do that without you being aware of this, and these are things that we deserve to know better answers, have better hearings on this. I do not believe a word that you're saying on this.
Simply put,
I do not wish to hear
Congressman,
from you. I'm not
simply
yielding you a
put,
moment
Congressman,
of time.
what you've
I'm
said
not
is
yielding
dead
you a moment
wrong.
of time. I don't wish
There
to
is
hear
no
your lies.
manipulation of
You've heard your
intelligence,
lies when you step up
period.
in front of the camera.
And
Not listening
you
to
have all been
Don't wish to hear
regularly
your lies.
apprised of the intelligence
no, thank you for your
assessments.
lies.
All the way
Not
through
looking
over
for
the
them.
The gentleman will
months.
Not looking to
suspend.
hear
And
your
that
lies.
is
The gentleman's
not true.
time.
Not looking to hear the
The gentleman's
Secretary's
time
lies.
has expired.
And so has the
The
Secretary.
gentleman's time has
so
expired.
is the Secretary.
The secretary can answer the question.
I didn't ask him a question.
You did ask a question.
I don't want to hear from the Secretary.
gentleman's time
he lies to
has
us when he
expired.
steps in front of the camera. That's
the
what he
gentleman's
does.
time
Lies to us when he
has
steps in front of the
expired.
camera. Expects the
Secretary,
Taliban to live up
the
to their
gentleman's
commitment to
time
counterterrorism. Least
has
believable
answered-
thing I've ever heard.
The gentleman's time has expired.
People need to use common
The
sense with
gentleman's
this
time
Secretary.
has expired. We're here to hear from the secretary.
Not to hear
The
lies.
gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Secretary, if you wish, you may answer the question.
We don't need to hear lies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to respond briefly, what the congressman said is simply wrong, period. Second, I think virtually every member of this committee has had access to or been apprised of the intelligence assessments throughout the year. And you know what they were, you know what they are. And we will continue to provide those assessments and those briefings in the weeks and months ahead. You've heard the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff say that he has not seen anything that indicated to him or to anyone else that the Afghan government and military would collapse in 11 days. The Director of National Intelligence has said that even in the days leading up to the Taliban takeover, intelligence agencies did not say collapse was imminent. This unfolded more quickly than we anticipated, including in the intelligence community. And I could go on. So what has been said and alleged is simply not true.
And that would be.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from Nevada,
If President
Ms. Dina
Biden was
Titus from
manipulating
Nevada,
intelligence.
is now
Obvious
recognized
assessment.
for
That
5
makes
minutes.
sense. That's why it all adds up.
The gentleman's
Thank you, Mr.
time has
Chairman.
expired.
He definitely
And the
proved the
gentleman
point.
will cease immediately.
He definitely proved the
The
point.
gentleman
well.
will
Thank you.
cease immediately.
Well, he proved the point. Thank you for letting him prove it. I appreciate that.
I now recognize